after praising them for a decade, after the sinking of the Cheonan last March, during the summer of this year, the Bush administration, the Obama administration began to start saying China is willfully ignoring North Korean bad behavior. That's pretty harsh terms, right? But after the shelling of Yeonpyeong Island in November, Admiral Mullen, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and several other officials used the term enabling North Korean bad behavior. Do y'all know what enabling behavior is? Yeah. I had to explain this to a lot of my friends in China when I was there in December, right? Enabling, if you define it, literally mean to enable is just to make it possible, right? To make it capable to do something, right? But this is drug addict vocabulary, right? If I'm a father, I love my son, he's a drug addict, but I don't want him to be out in the street, so I let him stay in my house even though he's using drugs. I don't want him to starve, so I give him food even though he's using drugs. I even give him money to buy stuff even though he might use it to buy drugs. And I don't want him to be too bored walking around and dangerous, so I'll drive him to meet his friends even though he uses drugs. Who's partially responsible for my son using drugs? Me, right? I'm enabling his bad behavior. I'm shielding him from the consequences of his drug use, and thereby I'm making it less likely that he will ever give up drugs. Right? That's called enabling behavior. And so when the U.S. says this about China, what are we saying? We're saying because you blocked the international community's response to the sinking of the Cheonan, because you refused to let the United Nations Security Council take up the issue of the uranium enrichment program, you are partially responsible for North Korea's bad behavior. And Secretary Clinton, she delivered what was called the first annual Dick Holbrooke address in the State Department just a week before the Hu-Obama summit, the Hu Jintao-Obama summit, and she put it as explicitly as she could. She said, if China had not shielded North Korea from the reaction to the Cheonan, would they have shelled Yeonpyeong Island? Direct connection. That's enabling behavior. And that's essentially what the U.S. is accusing China of. The Hu-Obama summit was okay. The truth is we should not have had any overly high expectations, right? Given the fact that Hu had done the old hug with Kim Jong-il twice and really gone, that was hard to change course on that front. But at the same time, I was disappointed the Chinese, not once during the whole summit and the press conference and the joint statement, ever said the word North Korea. They always said the Korean Peninsula problem, the Korean Peninsula nuclear problem. What Korean Peninsula nuclear problem? It's a North Korean nuclear problem. There's no nuclear problem in South Korea. But somehow the Chinese couldn't bring themselves to call out their ally North Korea. But there was some positive signs. There was one single paragraph, which is called in the joint statement between Obama and Hu, that dealt with Korea. And in that one single paragraph, 3 times, President Obama and President Hu mentioned the September 19, 2005 joint statement of the six-party talks. Isn't that a snoozer, right? That'll put you to sleep, right? What type of arcane diplomatic code speech is this, right? We're talking about some defunct talks that aren't going, some agreement from 2005 that's not been implemented. Why in the world would Gordon Flake think this is a meaningful thing? Well, here's the reason, right? The reality is that North Korea, when they say denuclearization, and we say denuclearization, it's not a question of tomato, right? It's a question of what do you mean? When the U.S. says denuclearization, we mean North Korea abandons its nuclear ambitions and returns to compliance with the NPT and the IAEA. When North Korea says denuclearization, what they mean is we too are a nuclear power. We, as equals with the United States, will negotiate mutual disarmament. And when the Russians and the Chinese and everybody else give up their nuclear weapons, maybe we'll give up ours too, because we're a nuclear power. So, obviously, for North Korea to say pihekwa, denuclearization, has limited meaning. But on September 19, 2005, jointly with the other parties in the six-party talks, Russia, China, South Korea, Japan, the United States, and North Korea said, and they agreed, we will abandon all nuclear weapons and existing nuclear programs and return at an early date to the IAEA and the NPT, unilaterally, right? So when the United States and the Chinese put that, that September 9, 2005 joint statement, it's saying this is how we jointly, U.S. and China, define denuclearization. Likewise, the six-party talks, there's nothing magical about six-party talks, right? I mean, 30 people sitting around a round table, there's nothing. That's a real awkward way to negotiate, right? It's not easy. What's important about the six-party talks is not the format, it's the content. And so after the shelling of Yeonpyeong Island, the Chinese, foolishly, tried to ask the South Koreans and the Japanese and the Americans to come to head of delegation talks with the six parties to talk about the crisis. Well, we all refused. And the Chinese were perplexed. Why would you refuse to come to talks? Well, the reality is, as long as North Korea continues to assert, we are a nuclear power, we must be accepted as a nuclear power, we'll negotiate as a nuclear power. The parameters of those discussions, we don't want them to change. Right? In other words, we would be de facto recognizing North Korea as a nuclear power, as a negotiating partner in that context. And so, by stating in this joint statement that the parameters of the six-party talks are the agreement, September 9, 2005 joint statement, it clarifies that's what we got to talk about first and foremost. Once we have an agreement on that, then we can talk about whatever we want. But until that happens, and so China and the U.S. are slightly better position than they were before. Also, for the first time, the Chinese agreed to mention that the uranium enrichment program was falling under the previous sanctions, resolutions, etc. So that's the arcane legalistic argument in terms of where we are right now. In the end, the problem isn't solved. The talks have broken down again. I fully anticipate that North Korea will initiate another provocation in the near future. So while it's been quiet since November, which is not a very long time, they have succession issue going on. They have their own internal dynamic. The talks aren't going anywhere. So I think we're in a very different dynamic going forward here. If I was really smart, I would tell you the solution. But the truth is, I don't think, it's not just me that's not really smart. Increasingly, it's apparent there is no easy solution to this issue because the problem is increasingly intertwined with the very nature and existence of the North Korean regime. And that makes it complex. So I've already gone on far too long. Why don't I stop there? And I'll open up the rest of the time for you to answer questions as you will. Yes?
I know recently the Obama administration initiated a reset policy with Russia and now Trump for the progressive relation. And Russia has had a long time pretty good relationship with China. How do you think this new reset policy can influence their impact in the whole North Korea-China relations, and what can they really make the Chinese do in the sense of preventing more further provocations?
The truth is the Russians have very little influence on this issue. They're very tangential in terms of the issue. I mean, obviously Moscow is a long ways away from the Far East. They're a player in name only. They've come to the meetings. They really haven't played a major leadership role one way or the other. From a U.S. perspective, they've kind of been a negative influence on the six-party talks to date. Traditionally, the problem is if Russia takes its position as more supportive of North Korea, then that makes it easier for China to take that position. They won't be as isolated. So just to give you an example, I think one of the tremendous successes in the spring of 2009 under the Obama administration was the fact that they first got a common position between the U.S., South Korea, and Japan in terms of what they wanted. So North Korea tested a long-range missile, first time since 1998, or I know it's been 2003 since they tested it, right? During that period of time, no, I'm sorry, first time since 2006, so they tested a long-range missile. The Russian and Chinese position was, it's a satellite, it's not a violation of any UN Security Council sanctions resolutions, we don't have anything to do with this. The Japanese, South Korean, American position was, this is a missile launch. It's a violation of the previous UN Security Council sanctions resolutions, and we want a UN Security Council sanctions resolutions. In the end, what happened was, we got a presidential statement. The presidential statement said, the launch, doesn't matter with a satellite or missile, the launch is a violation of the previous resolution 1718. Again, this may sound arcane, but essentially what China and Russia were both saying, China in particular is that our ally North Korea does not have the sovereign right to test either a missile or a satellite, long range. Tough statement, right? They would have never come to there had the U.S., South Korea, and Japan not been on the same page. So we pulled them, much further than they ever wanted to go, not to where we wanted to be, but much further than they were comfortable going in that regard. Had the Russians been on our side, it would have been much easier in that regard. And the last point I'll note is that in March, after the sinking of the Cheonan, the Russians prevaricated. They too didn't participate, didn't want to be part of the process, and basically made it easy for the Chinese to ignore the evidence of the sinking of the Cheonan. Right? In fact, the Russians actually issued a horrible, self-serving, inaccurate report saying that they couldn't conclude what happened when, every issue they raised in the point had already been demonstrably kind of refuted and very open public evidence beforehand. But after the sinking of the Yeonpyeong island, the Russians sided up squarely with South Korea, the United States, and Japan, and that put China in a much more awkward position in that regard. So there's a tangential role in that regard. They don't have any direct influence on China. China is obviously the much more influential, powerful player here. Russia's a tangential player here.
yesterday we were talking about who holds the key to the nuclear North Korea.
Oh, that's not good. Sorry.
To this situation, and we were like, some of us think North Korea's regime change might, change things to the situation. Oh no, it's the South Korea, North Korea. Like they need to figure it out. Then it'll be solved. No, it's China. So who do you lean towards? Like could be like holding the key to the solution?
Again, this is going to make me sound like a knuckle-dragging Neanderthal Dick Cheney acolyte, right? But I would tell you my honest, truthful assessment that we cannot solve the nuclear problem in North Korea absent unification. At this point, I cannot imagine a scenario in which the current regime in North Korea abandons its nuclear ambitions. I can't imagine it. It's so, at this point, intertwined with their identity. The entire nation knows their nuclear power. They've been bragging about it, thumping their chest about it for such a long time. The notion that they would somehow be able to give it up right now, I have a hard time seeing in that regard. And part of it's just because, what they would require for us to give it up, we can't give them. Structurally, we just can't give them through us forward. So this raises a very interesting question about unification, what it means. For the better part of 20 years, after German unification, the South Koreans watched German unification. In the first year, they're like, wow, that's great, we want that. We want that too. And then they saw the cost. And then they saw the social disruption. They said, maybe later. Let's just delay that. And so then, for the better part of 15, 16 years, South Korean views of unification were, yes, we want unification later. Just put it off. And the policy was, the official policy was, that by gradually integrating the two economies, that we come closer and closer to unification, and the cost would be cheaper. Makes perfect sense. I agreed with it, 100%, right? Because the cost would be cataclysmic at that point, right? Well, that really led to a lot of other policy issues. So if we could just solve the nuclear issue, that would bring us closer to unification. If we could solve the missile issue, that would bring us closer to unification. If we could solve the human rights issue, or the drug smuggling, or the counterfeiting, or the famine in North Korea, or their economic paralysis, these things would make it more likely to have unification. I have to tell you though, honestly, right now, if I look at North Korea in 2011, I have, maybe I'm just jaded. I've been looking at this too long, but I can't imagine a scenario in which any of those things happen until unification. So we've gotten to the point where unification was the goal, the long-range vision, and these things were the means to the end, to the point where unification is the means to the end, right? You solve these problems by unification. Now the problem is then, how do you unify, right? I mean, you can't attack North Korea. South Korean public opinion has shifted dramatically on North Korea. From a decade of progressive government of engaging North Korea, in early 2008, I guess, 2008, South Korean tourists were shot in the back in the Diamond Mountain tourism thing. The North Koreans wouldn't investigate it. And a South Korean manager was held hostage at the Kaesong industrial site by the North Koreans for a long period of time with no apology. Sinking of the Cheonan, shelling of the Yeonpyeong Island, nuclear tests, missile tests. As you might imagine, South Koreans are not overly enthusiastic now about engaging with North Korea. Public opinion shifted dramatically in that regard. But that said, public support for unification has also gone down in South Korea. If you ask them in 1997, do you think unification is necessary? It's like 96%. If you ask them in 2008, do you think unification is necessary? It's like 68%. I'm sure that it's gone down since then too. And even those that think it's necessary still want it long-term, because of the cost. That said, I think there's a strategy here that if there is major instability in North Korea, South Korea